She was dismissed as a confused old woman, mocked, ignored, and told to step aside. But what the SWAT team didn't know was that she had once led operations they couldn't even pronounce. In the middle of a hostage crisis, 5 quiet words from her stopped everything. What happened next didn't just save lives. It exposed a system built on assumptions. This is the untold story of Sergeant Althea Monroe, and how silence became her most powerful weapon. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon on 14th Street, sunlight casting long shadows across the apartment complex as residents gathered behind police barricades. But for 69-year-old Sergeant Althea Monroe, a retired Army field strategist with a decorated past, the moment unfolded like a slow-motion insult, wrapped in flashing lights and armored indifference. She'd only stepped outside to check on her neighbor, a teenage boy she'd seen crying near the dumpster 2 nights ago. Instead, she found herself surrounded by an agitated SWAT team, preparing to breach Building C, where a suspect had taken hostages on the 3rd floor. The atmosphere buzzed with tension, gear being adjusted, weapons clicked into readiness, radios alive with clipped voices. In the middle of it, Althea stood alone, wearing a plain hoodie and sneakers, watching silently with eyes that had mapped combat zones more complex than anything these officers had trained for. But they didn't see her experience, they saw her skin, they saw her age, and they decided she didn't belong. "Ma'am, the community center is a block that way." One officer smirked as he waved her off. "This is no place for old folks." Laughter trickled through the unit. Another officer motioned for backup. "Let's get her out of here before she starts asking for bingo cards." What they didn't realize was that Althea lived on the 3rd floor of that very building. She had for over 2 decades, and in that time, she had memorized every blueprint, every blind spot, and every vulnerability in its structure. But none of that mattered. Not in the presence of implicit bias sharpened by adrenaline and armor. Under stress, the human brain defaults to shortcuts. In the officer's eyes, Althea was not a neighbor or a possible witness. She was a disruption, a liability. This wasn't just procedural neglect. It was a textbook case of unconscious exclusion driven by mental shortcuts that aligned race, age, and perceived irrelevance. When white residents emerged behind her, they were greeted politely and ushered to safety without question. No ID checks, no condescension, no suspicion. The contrast was stark, and it echoed a deeper cultural pattern where legitimacy is unconsciously coded as white, youthful, and assertive. Althea didn't yell. She didn't push back. She stepped back behind the tape and lowered her hood, allowing the sun to catch the silver in her curls. She understood something they didn't. Their mockery wasn't personal. It was systemic, and like many who came before her, she'd learned that silence could often scream louder than protest. Across the street, officers scurried over blueprints. The suspect hadn't responded in hours. Crisis negotiators were stalling, an armored vehicle repositioned, but no one noticed that the angle of entry left half the team exposed. Althea did. Her mind, trained in battlefield risk assessments, caught it immediately. She noticed something else, too. The chemical scent on the breeze. Weeks ago, she had reported it to building management. Like now, her concerns had been waved off. This wasn't just a hostage situation. It was a pattern, a system that dismisses warnings when they come from the wrong voice. A crisis allowed to unfold, not from a lack of tools, but from a failure to listen. and that failure would soon cost them. What makes a story go viral isn't just action, it's contrast. It's when the smallest figure on the screen becomes the most powerful one. Althea, ridiculed as a harmless bystander, would soon become the center of the storm, not because she raised her voice, but because her quiet presence contained more authority than the command center's entire playbook. By the time the team was preparing to breach, her intuition had already calculated the risk and the casualties, and just before she turned to walk away, she whispered 5 words that no one expected, words that would freeze the entire perimeter and unravel years of buried assumptions. Sergeant Althea Monroe didn't look like someone who could alter the course of a SWAT operation. Dressed in second-hand jeans and worn sneakers, she stood just outside the yellow tape as heavily armed officers buzzed past her, coordinating their final assault on the hostage situation upstairs. Radios crackled. Shouted commands filled the air. Every second pushed the operation closer to what they believed would be a textbook extraction. But Althea could already see the ending, and it wasn't in the textbook. 3 weeks prior, she had noticed a man slipping in and out of Unit 3C at odd hours, always careful, always carrying something in unmarked bags. She'd also detected a strange odor, chemical, acrid, on the floor just beneath the apartment. She had filed a complaint. The building superintendent promised to look into it. He never did. Days later, she'd observed the same man leaving a package taped with red wires in the hallway and knew something wasn't right. She called the local precinct, but her call was logged, not investigated. She was old, she was black, and she didn't sound urgent. Now she stood watching the same apartment swarming with officers who had refused to hear her. She had warned them, not once, but 3 times. Her voice had been easy to dismiss, wrapped in the skin of someone society had quietly decided no longer had authority. "Ma'am, I said move," an officer repeated, this time placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "I know this building," Althea replied evenly, eyes not leaving the SWAT formation. "I served 27 years in the military. There's a secondary access route between Units 3C and 3E that doesn't appear on your blueprint. They're walking into a trap." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You can't be here. You're not part of this. I was part of this before you knew what a blast radius was," she replied, voice low but steady. He waved for backup. Captain Bennett, the field commander, approached with a furrowed brow. "What seems to be the issue?" "She's interfering with operations," the officer said. "She's trying to save your team," Althea cut in. "You breach the door without rerouting through the E-wing, and you'll lose 3 men in under a minute. The trigger point is at chest level, just inside the entry, set to respond to kinetic pressure." Bennett smirked. "You a bomb tech now?" "I used to train them." The sarcasm in his eyes couldn't mask the tension he was feeling. "Look, ma'am." But she interrupted, calmly, deliberately, her eyes locked on his. "Echo Division, Task Force Granite, Operation Helix time stilled." The names weren't common knowledge. Bennett blinked. His radio slipped slightly in his grip. The perimeter slowed, just a beat, as the information caught like flint inside his memory. "What did you say?" he asked, voice quieter now. Althea stepped forward and said 5 words that silenced every officer within earshot. "Strategic lead, Operation Iron Lantern." And just like that, everything shifted. Behind the tape, officers who had snickered earlier began whispering. The weight of those 5 words cracked open a hidden vault of history. Iron Lantern was one of the most classified field extractions of the last 40 years, buried so deeply in military intelligence that few even knew it existed. Fewer still had ever met someone who'd led it. Captain Bennett turned away, radioing command. Within seconds, chatter flooded his headset, confirmation codes, operational rosters. A brief silence followed. Then, identity verified, full clearance granted, defer to Monroe. Officers snapped to attention. Helmets were removed. The tone on the street flipped from casual disrespect to rigid formality. But Althea didn't flinch or preen. She simply nodded and stepped closer to the tactical map laid across the hood of the armored vehicle. "You've misread the interior wall dimensions," she said, tracing her finger across the layout. "This gap here, that's a collapsed shaft from the old boiler reroute, never updated in city records. Your breach team will expose their flank if they enter through the front. There's a better way." Lieutenant Marissa Chan, a negotiation specialist barely in her 30s, stood nearby, taking in every word. Unlike the others, she hadn't mocked Althea earlier. In fact, she'd observed quietly as the older woman's presence unsettled the status quo. Now she stepped forward. "I'm Lieutenant Chan," she said respectfully. "Would you be willing to consult directly with our tech team?" Althea nodded. "But you're running out of time." She didn't have to say more. The bomb, she suspected, was real and likely pressure-triggered. She had seen similar builds during covert extraction missions in Eastern Europe, but this wasn't about weaponry. This was about being heard. A month ago, she had tried to warn them, and no one had listened. Now, with lives at stake, her knowledge could no longer be ignored. As Chan relayed Althea's observations, Captain Bennett watched from a distance. He hadn't spoken since confirming her identity, but the realization was sinking in. This woman they'd dismissed wasn't just credible. She was the expert. One of the rookies approached awkwardly. "Sergeant Monroe, can I ask why you didn't say who you were earlier?" Althea didn't look up. Would it have mattered? The question hung in the air like smoke. The answer was already known. She continued working as if nothing had changed, identifying weak points in the layout, tracing escape routes, timing ventilation cycles that could help neutralize toxins if gas was involved. Her mind moved with military precision, and in that moment, the SWAT team wasn't just relying on her. They were following her. The 5 words had flipped the power dynamic, but they hadn't erased the humiliation. The truth was stark. Until she proved she was a decorated war strategist, she was just another old black lady in the eyes of the system. But that was about to change. For them and for her. Because soon they would find out the man inside the apartment wasn't just a threat. He was a former operative, one she had trained, one whose mind had splintered under the weight of abandonment and betrayal. And she wasn't done yet. She would save those hostages, and along the way she would make sure this time the system had no choice but to listen. Althea Monroe stood between 2 eras, one defined by the instincts of field warfare, and the other by algorithmic risk assessments and tactical simulations. But when Lieutenant Noel Cruz approached her with a quiet deference that the others lacked, it wasn't military rank that connected them. It was recognition, not of authority, but of earned respect. Cruz was in her early 30s, mixed race with sharp eyes that scanned for truth between the lines. Unlike the others, she hadn't dismissed Althea with a glance. Even during the earlier confrontation, she had watched, not judging, not doubting, but observing. And now, with pressure mounting and options narrowing, she made the kind of choice that separates leaders from followers. She extended her hand, not as a gesture of formality, but of partnership. "Walk me through it," Cruz said, her voice measured. Althea pointed to the schematic on the hood of the patrol SUV. "There's an error here. This wall?" She tapped twice. "It doesn't exist. Not the way you think. It was patched over during the 2009 retrofit after the fire in the E-Wing. There's now a crawl space connecting units 3C and 3E. Cruz nodded slowly. "Which isn't in city records." "Correct. I only know it because I helped coordinate the emergency evacuation drills when they rebuilt. I had them use collapsible vent panels. He could be anywhere between those two units right now." Cruz leaned in, so he could be watching our movements, even listening. "Almost certainly. And if he's who I think he is, he's already factored in every breach angle your team's rehearsing." "You know him?" Althea took a slow breath. "Yes. His name is Kendrick Shaw. I trained him during Operation Granite Halo in 1996. Last I heard, he disappeared after a failed debrief. They said he died in the Balkans, but I knew better." A silence hung between them. Cruz didn't ask how Althea had kept that knowledge to herself. She understood the burden of unconfirmed truths in a system that treats aging veterans like ghosts. "Why here? Why now?" Cruz asked. "Because this building is familiar. It was used for mock infiltration drills before it was converted into residential units. Shaw knows every inch of it. And so do I." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in intergenerational synergy. Althea didn't demand control. She offered intelligence. Cruz didn't blindly defer. She validated through action. Together they built an alternate assault plan, one that prioritized minimizing casualties while establishing a back door for communication. Cruz redirected drones to gather visual recon on 3E's back windows. Althea walked her through ventilation patterns, recalibrating gas dispersal protocols. Every suggestion was rooted in lived experience, not just technical, but behavioral, predicting Shaw's moves based on personality fractures formed in post-conflict isolation. As they worked, more officers began gathering around, not because they were ordered to, but because they couldn't look away. They watched as this elderly black woman, whom many had ignored just hours earlier, broke down a high-risk hostage scenario with a precision no manual could replicate. Some struggled to reconcile the image. Confirmation bias had etched Althea into their minds as a civilian bystander, maybe someone confused or senile, but now that illusion was cracking. Not just because of what she knew, but because of how she shared it. With control, with clarity, without ego. Lieutenant Cruz took notes with a stylus, not pretending to already know. "Tell me again about the motion sensor on the west sill." Althea nodded. "He'll pair it with a vibration trigger, likely linked to a fail-safe detonator in the HVAC duct. If he hears a battering ram breach, he'll activate manually. But if he hears someone he trusts, like you." "Exactly." Cruz paused. "Do you want to try to contact him?" "I have to, but not through your comms. He'll scan for RF interference. Give me an analog option. I'll use his name, his old name." While Cruz arranged a secure handheld transmitter, Captain Bennett approached hesitantly. The expression on his face, once stiff with smug certainty, was now deeply conflicted. "Sergeant Monroe," he began. Althea turned, not unkindly. I didn't know who you were." "You still don't," she replied, soft but unyielding. "But you'll learn." Cruz looked at him flatly. "We're proceeding with her plan." He didn't argue. Just then a field analyst ran over with an update. A small device had been confirmed on the third-floor windowsill, barely visible, but definitely a trigger. Althea smiled faintly. "I told you, visual confirmation." Cruz looked over. "Why didn't we see this before?" "Because you weren't looking for what didn't fit the narrative," Althea said. "Prejudice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it makes you miss what's in plain sight." That line would later appear in a police department training video. The plan took shape, fast. Althea would be escorted to the stairwell alone. She would initiate contact using analog voice without visible weaponry. A sniper team would track from a distance but hold fire unless a detonator became visible. Cruz would monitor radio silence and step in only if protocols broke. Before she went in, Cruz walked with her down the hallway. "You shouldn't have had to prove yourself like this." "I've had to all my life." "Well," Cruz said, "you changed the whole operation in under an hour." Althea met her gaze. "Number, you did. You listened." Cruz didn't respond, but the nod she gave wasn't polite. It was reverent. That single moment of genuine collaboration between generations, backgrounds, and lived truths would ripple long after the hostages were saved. It was more than tactical cooperation. It was the kind of strategic alliance that exposed not just what the institution lacked, but what it could become. Together they weren't just rewriting the mission, they were rewriting the culture. As the SWAT perimeter tightened and snipers realigned for cover, Sergeant Althea Monroe stood at the edge of the stairwell, alone. No helmet, no comms, just a handheld analog transmitter clutched in her palm. Her heart beat slow and steady, each pulse a memory of a mission survived, a brother lost, a lesson earned. This moment wasn't new. Only the context had changed. Across the stairwell, the door to Unit 3C sat closed. Inside, 3 hostages remained bound and terrified. And somewhere beyond that door was Kendrick Shaw, the man who had once saluted her, once trained beside her, once risked his life under her command. Now he was the man the world called unstable, dangerous, disposable. "Shaw." Althea spoke softly into the device. "It's Monroe." Silence. She took one slow step forward, careful not to trigger vibrations. "You remember Bahrain? 2nd floor of the Al Safra compound? You told me you could smell fear before you ever saw it." Another pause, then a voice, hoarse and cracked. "Monroe, is it really you?" Her breath stayed even. "Eagle 1, Sierra Lima Delta, no codes, just truth." The line went dead. But seconds later, a mechanical click echoed from inside the door. Althea waited. The door opened a crack. One gray eye peered through. Shaw had aged, not in years, but in anguish. His face, once strong and composed, now twitched with mistrust and exhaustion. Scar tissue tugged at his jawline. His fingers trembled, one wrapped around a thumb-sized detonator. "They said you were dead," he murmured. "They say a lot of things when they want to forget us," Althea replied. He opened the door wider. She stepped inside. The room was dim, curtains drawn. The smell of sweat and soldered wire hung heavy in the air. The 3 hostages sat against the far wall, shaken but unharmed. Shaw paced, his movements sharp but disjointed, like someone caught between instinct and chaos. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "They'll breach. They'll kill us both. They won't move unless you force them." Althea said calmly. "I've stalled them, but I need you to tell me what this is really about." He looked up, eyes flickering with rage and despair. "You know what it's about. They left us behind. All of us. Beirut, Pristina, Kandahar. When the missions ended, so did we. No pensions, no medical care, just silence." "I know," she said, stepping closer. "I tried to get help," Shaw continued. "VA appointments 6 months out. PTSD programs cut. They sent me a pamphlet, Monroe." She didn't argue. She didn't deflect. Instead, she sat down across from him. Same level, same posture, same former uniform, now invisible. "What's in your bag?" she asked gently. He nodded toward the couch. "Documents, files, names of others. I was going to release them, not to hurt anyone, just to be heard. And the explosives? To be taken seriously. It was all heartbreak, wrapped in a threat. Not malice, desperation. You were one of the best I ever trained," she said. "But this will erase that." His eyes narrowed. "They already erased us." "I know," she said again. "But you still have a choice." He looked at her, really looked, and his hand wavered on the detonator. "What if I surrender and they shoot me anyway?" "Then I walk with you out that door. And if they shoot me too." A heavy silence. Then he collapsed onto the floor, shoulders shaking. Althea moved quickly. She secured the detonator with one hand and wrapped the other around his back. No aggression, just human contact, the kind forgotten by war and bureaucracy. Outside, crews monitored every heartbeat through a silent monitor. Tension filled the tactical van. Captain Bennett hovered near the command terminal, fingers twitching to override. But Cruz stopped him with a glance. "She's still in control," Cruz whispered. "Let her finish." Inside, Shaw gestured to the hostages. "Tell them I never meant to hurt them." "You will," Althea said softly, "if you don't end this right now." He stood. With Althea at his side, Kendrick opened the door fully and raised both hands. The hostages followed behind him. As they crossed the hallway, lights from flashbang-equipped shields flickered to life, but no one moved. Then Althea spoke into a nearby radio. 5 words, firm and unmistakable. "All clear. Tactical stand down." The SWAT team froze. Then slowly, weapons lowered. Behind them, Lieutenant Cruz sprinted up the stairs, relief flooding her face. She took control of the scene, while Althea led Shaw into custody, speaking softly into his ear. "Healing's possible, but you've got to walk through fire first." That moment, Shaw's surrender, the calm evacuation, the visible restraint from law enforcement, would later be dissected by news anchors, policymakers, and training academies nationwide. But none of them could fully grasp what made it possible. It wasn't just tactics. It wasn't threat negotiation. It was trust, earned, not by force, but by the courage to see past the label of dangerous black veteran and into the man that trauma had warped. In that apartment, Althea didn't just save lives. She proved a deeper truth. That dignity can't be legislated. It has to be shown, modeled, lived. By sunrise, the hostage standoff on 14th Street was over. The building still stood. The hostages were safe. No rounds had been fired, no blood spilled. But something far deeper had ruptured. The video footage went viral before the sun even hit the rooftops. A bystander's shaky phone captured the moment Sergeant Althea Monroe calmly walked out of the apartment, guiding 3 frightened civilians with one hand and holding the disarmed suspect's detonator in the other. Her posture was upright, her steps unhurried. The SWAT team behind her parted like water. Frozen by a 5-word command they were never trained to question. By mid-morning, every major news outlet was airing segments titled some version of "She was ignored, then she saved everyone." Social media churned out hashtags like respect I cerned, for Monroe did that, and the most cutting of all, "Hey Grandma," a twist on the mockery she had endured hours before. The optics were unforgiving. Clips of officers dismissing her presence, rolling their eyes, or cracking ageist jokes stood in sharp contrast to her precise, fearless handling of the crisis. Side-by-side video edits surfaced, comparing the way white residents were politely escorted to safety, while Monroe, despite being a resident and a former military strategist, was treated like a trespasser. Public outrage ignited fast. But it wasn't just righteous anger. It was grief, too. Grief that a woman with decades of service had to prove her worth through near-miraculous heroism just to be believed. At police headquarters, damage control meetings began before breakfast. Lieutenant Noel Cruz was summoned to provide a debrief. She didn't sugarcoat a word. The operation was compromised before it even began. She stated plainly, not because of a lack of equipment or training, but because of internal bias. The most informed voice on the scene was ignored for hours because of her age, gender, and race. The department's media unit scrambled to shift the narrative, releasing a statement praising Monroe's bravery and announcing a formal commendation. But it backfired. Critics called it performative respect, an attempt to paper over the structural bias that nearly led to disaster. Within 48 hours, Mayor Patricia Cline held a press conference. Flanked by community leaders, veterans advocates, and Monroe herself, the mayor announced a multi-phase police reform initiative. But the spotlight wasn't on her. It was on Althea. Standing behind the podium in a blazer too modest for the weight of her accomplishments, Althea declined to give a triumphant speech. Instead, she told the city what they needed to hear. "Don't thank me for doing what the system wouldn't. Just make sure I'm the last person who has to do it." The press room went silent. Reporters later noted the absence of Lieutenant Michael Hale, one of the officers who had mocked Althea on the sidewalk. Internally, it was leaked that he had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his conduct. But the real reckoning ran deeper than disciplinary actions. A review of the department's body cam footage and radio logs revealed a pattern of dismissiveness toward civilians, especially older black residents. It wasn't isolated, it was cultural, it was systemic. Community organizations mobilized quickly. Petitions circulated demanding a civilian-led oversight board with real authority to hold officers accountable. By week's end, over 120,000 signatures had been gathered, but even beyond law enforcement, Monroe's story exposed another institutional failure: how America handles its veterans. Interviews with Kendrick Shaw, now in federal custody and receiving psychiatric care, revealed a cascade of neglect, denied VA benefits, misclassified discharge status, months-long waits for trauma counseling. His radicalization hadn't come from ideology. It had come from abandonment. Althea knew that story all too well, and she refused to let it continue. With support from veterans organizations, she proposed a new federal program, Echo Watch, designed to track, rehabilitate, and support high-risk former operatives who had fallen through bureaucratic cracks. Modeled after behavioral intervention programs in major cities, Echo Watch focused on identifying early warning signs, social withdrawal, erratic housing patterns, PTSD episodes, and deploying veteran-led response teams. Congressional hearings were scheduled within 2 weeks. Crews accompanied Althea to Washington, testifying on how structural blind spots in both law enforcement and military reintegration had nearly led to catastrophe. It wasn't just about one officer mocking one woman, Crews told lawmakers. It was about a chain of assumptions, unchecked, that led us to dismiss the very person who could save lives. Meanwhile, police departments across the country began citing the Monroe Protocol in their internal reviews, a mandate to prioritize unconventional intelligence in crisis zones, especially from civilian experts or veterans with lived tactical knowledge. One particularly poignant reform came not from legislation, but from within the precinct. Lieutenant Hale, after disciplinary hearings and a public apology, quietly requested reassignment, not to administration, but to the city's new Bias Reflection and Response Unit, a training wing that Althea herself would help design. He showed up on her first day of instruction, dressed in plain clothes, eyes lowered but resolute. "I'm not here to redeem myself," he said. "I'm here to unlearn what I was taught." Althea studied him. "Then you'll be more useful now than you ever were in uniform." Word spread. The first class filled to capacity. Recruits, veterans, even mid-ranking officers enrolled in sessions taught not with theory, but with lived consequence. Althea didn't lecture. She asked questions. What does authority look like? Who gets believed first? What's the cost of ignoring someone you think doesn't look like help? These weren't academic exercises. They were recalibrations of perception, challenges to a culture that had relied too long on a hierarchy of trust filtered through uniform, race, and youth. One slide, shown in every session, featured 2 still frames from the viral footage. In one, Althea being dismissed. In the other, Althea walking hostages to safety. The caption read simply, "Same woman, different perception." By month's end, local crime watch groups started their own initiatives, pairing senior residents with precinct liaisons to increase communication flow during emergencies. VA centers in 5 states launched expedited outreach to veterans flagged for possible post-service distress. And across police departments, the phrase, "Monroe it," began circulating as shorthand for rechecking assumptions. But for Althea, the most meaningful moment came quietly. One evening after teaching her final session of the week, she returned home to find a handwritten letter on her doorstep. It was from one of the hostages, a 14-year-old girl named Jada. "You didn't just save us. You showed me what strength looks like when no one sees it coming. I want to be like you." Althea sat on her couch, letter trembling in her hands. She had faced down explosives, held a collapsing soldier in her arms, stood unmoved before a wall of assault rifles. But nothing hit harder than that line. Because in the end, public fallout and institutional reckoning weren't the story's greatest legacy. It was the fact that one woman's dignity had cracked something open. Inside a system, yes, but also inside a generation that had grown up expecting silence from people like her. And now they were listening. 2 months after the 14th Street hostage standoff, what began as a single moment of overlooked wisdom evolved into something much larger. A national recalibration. In a brick building once used as a post office in downtown Baltimore, a new sign was affixed to the doorway. The Tempest Program, Veteran Recon, Recovery, and Reintegration Division. Its director, Sergeant Althea Monroe, arrived quietly on foot that morning, No media crews, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a secure clipboard under her arm and a line of chairs inside, filled with people no one had called in years. The Tempest program wasn't a policy experiment or a think tank. It was a mission designed to locate and engage former covert operatives, special unit veterans, and high-risk military personnel who had fallen through the cracks. The program became the first federally recognized initiative to integrate psychological recovery, threat prevention, and veteran advocacy under one roof. Shaw was the first case. After the incident, federal agencies had attempted to charge him with terrorism, but Althea intervened directly, invoking operational precedents, psychiatric evaluations, and a blunt truth no official wanted to say aloud. You ignored him until he broke. You don't get to punish him for the consequences of that silence. He was remanded into Tempest custody. Within a month, Kendrick Shaw was receiving inpatient therapy, peer counseling, and supervised community integration. For the first time since he left the battlefield, he was sleeping through the night. And he wasn't alone. Dozens more followed. The program employed a team of cross-disciplinary specialists, trauma psychologists, former military chaplains, recon analysts, and trained mediators, many of whom were veterans themselves. They created mobile recovery units to visit shelters, halfway houses, and underfunded VA clinics. Each day, their message was simple: you haven't been forgotten. Meanwhile, word spread in Washington. What had initially been treated as a fluke, a one-time act of heroism, was now being studied in committee rooms and law schools. The Monroe Directive, drafted in conjunction with civil rights advisors and law enforcement veterans, became a blueprint for integrating community intelligence into tactical protocols. Key elements included unconventional witness validation, training officers to recognize the value of non-traditional informants, especially from marginalized communities and older populations, before, not after, a crisis. Veteran distress markers, a nationwide alert system allowing police departments to identify signs of operational trauma and behavioral deterioration in former service members. Mandatory bias audits, quarterly evaluations of precinct-level interactions, analyzing who gets dismissed, who gets believed, and why. The program wasn't without critics. Some called it idealistic. Others resented the shift in command philosophy, especially those who felt displaced by the rise of civilian integrated operations. But the data told a different story. Within 3 months of Tempest's pilot phase, cities participating in its protocol saw a 37% reduction in force escalation during veteran-related incidents. Reports of ignored civilian input during emergencies dropped by 52%. And perhaps most telling, over 70% of participating officers reported that the training changed how they assessed situations involving older or minority community members. Still, Althea knew real reform couldn't live in metrics alone. One afternoon, as she walked through the program's intake center, she saw a man sitting silently in the back row. His beard was untrimmed, eyes distant. His hands trembled, not from age, but from hypervigilance. She recognized the posture immediately. Combat readiness, turned inward. She approached without announcement. "Army?" she asked. "Recon, 2006 to 2009, he replied. "Where'd they send you after?" "No place that fixed anything." She sat beside him. "You're not here to be fixed," she said. "You're here to be heard." He broke down without a word. and she stayed there, just listening, the same way Cruz had done for her. While Althea led the veteran recovery arm of the program, Lieutenant Noel Cruz became a national advocate for police reform, appearing in panels and task forces. She emphasized empathy training, community-led tactical reviews, and the importance of countering decision-making bias before it becomes policy. Together they launched a multi-city campaign called Ask First, Dismiss Never. The initiative encouraged departments to adopt layered consultation before launching operations, incorporating voices from local residents, social workers, and veterans familiar with the environment. It wasn't about replacing expertise. It was about expanding the definition of it. Back in Baltimore, the walls of the Tempest building were slowly filling with portraits, not of battles but of recoveries, reunions between families, veterans reading to school children, men and women once feared now rebuilding playgrounds and libraries. One image stood out, a framed photo of Althea and Kendrick standing beside a fresh mural on the side of a community center. It read, in bold, stenciled lettering, "Invisible does not mean irrelevant." Federal officials, seeing the program's success, expanded its funding. By the start of the next fiscal year, 7 new Tempest branches were scheduled to open in major metro areas: Atlanta, Chicago, Seattle, Oakland, Newark, San Antonio, and New Orleans. And Althea. She refused to sit behind a desk full-time. Twice a week, she ran what she called perception drills for police trainees and field medics. In one drill, trainees were asked to identify the most likely source of critical intelligence from a group of role-playing civilians. Over 80% failed the first time, choosing the loudest, most assertive character while dismissing the older woman quietly observing from the back. Only after debrief did they realize the bystander held the key to the entire scenario. Althea never scolded. She only asked, "What stopped you from listening to her?" The point was never to embarrass. It was to awaken. Because if the Tempest program had taught her anything, it was that healing didn't start with apology. It started with visibility. People like her, black, female, aging, weren't anomalies in heroism. They were just rarely seen. And now, for the first time, the system was watching, and, more importantly, learning. The headlines had quieted. The viral videos had faded. But in one modest training room inside the Baltimore branch of Tempest, a quote etched into the wall ensured the lesson would remain. Wisdom ignored is danger multiplied. It was attributed not to Althea Monroe, but to Collective Field Debrief Number 1, the first time the system wrote her words down and decided they were worth remembering. 6 months after the 14th Street incident, the buzz had slowed. The hashtags faded. The headlines drifted to newer crises. But within the modest walls of the Tempest program's headquarters in Baltimore, the work didn't stop, and neither did Sergeant Althea Monroe. By now, the halls bore her fingerprints, whiteboards filled with observations, diagrams of behavioral flags, annotated floor plans of subsidized housing units from 6 states. Her desk was never tidy. That wasn't her way. She didn't chase ceremony. She chased systems, how they failed, where they fractured, and how to fuse their broken pieces into something stronger. But on one cold morning in February, something unusual happened. Lieutenant Michael Hale walked in. He had been transferred to a remote evidence processing facility after the internal review of the 14th Street operation. Though the investigation had not led to termination, his reputation had suffered. Gone were the handshakes in the break room, The invitations to tactical briefings stopped. In a department that fed on bravado and unspoken loyalty, Hale had become radioactive. Now he stood at the threshold of Monroe's training room, in civilian clothes, holding nothing but a notepad and uncertainty. Althea looked up from her papers. Her gaze was clear, not cold. "You came. I asked to be reassigned here," he said. "I need to learn what I missed." She gestured toward the empty chair by the window. "Then start by observing." Hale joined a class already in session. Monroe was leading a module titled Authority versus Assumption. She ran through scenarios drawn not from simulations, but from real cases, ones where authority was undermined because it came in the wrong package, wrong skin tone, wrong age, wrong gender. "Tell me," she asked the group of recruits, "when you picture a credible witness in a high-stakes situation, who do you see?" They gave predictable answers. White men, first responders, business professionals. "Now," she said, "what if I told you that most operational breaches over the last 10 years were prevented not by those in uniform, but by civilians, residents, janitors, mothers, veterans who never got their paperwork processed?" She clicked to the next slide. On screen was a blurry security photo, an elderly woman pointing to a building's blueprints during a hostage incident. The timestamp was 5 hours before the breach. No one had listened to her. 4 people had died. "She was right," Monroe said, "but she wasn't heard." After class, Hale approached her again. "I mocked you," he said plainly. "That day, I saw a civilian, not a soldier. I saw what I wanted to see." "You saw what you were taught to see," she corrected. "Now you're unlearning it. Do you think it matters, me being here?" "That depends," she replied. "Are you here to repair yourself or the system?" He didn't answer, not with words. But the next day, he returned, and the day after that. Soon he was leading a workshop of his own, co-facilitated by Monroe, on tactical humility. Together they coined a term that would appear in the department's new field manual, situational ego suspension. It referred to the active practice of removing personal bias when presented with unfamiliar sources of intelligence, especially during high adrenaline operations. Beyond Baltimore, the ripple effects continued. The Monroe Directive had been adopted in over a dozen precincts. Police cadet graduation ceremonies now included a segment on veteran reintegration, with segments featuring former operatives like Kendrick Shaw, who was now a full-time speaker for the Tempest program's outreach division. Shaw's transformation wasn't easy. His trauma hadn't vanished, his record hadn't been erased. But he stood every week before young officers, telling them what it felt like to be forgotten, to be a threat in the eyes of a country he had risked everything to protect. His talks weren't about guilt. They were about seeing clearly, listening fully. And for Monroe, that clarity became the foundation of her quiet legacy. She never ran for office. She declined awards beyond the first commendation from the mayor. But one room in the police academy now bore her name, Monroe Hall, dedicated to field scenario recalibration and pattern recognition training. The room wasn't pristine. It was lived in, like her. Bulletin boards were filled with timelines of near misses, case reviews, and officer-submitted moments of reflection. One card stood out. It was from a former recruit who had once doubted her methods. "I hesitated to listen to a store clerk during a robbery. She noticed something I didn't. Because of her, I didn't open that door. That hesitation saved my partner. Thank you, Althea never framed it." She pinned it beside a photo of herself and Lieutenant Cruz. The two women standing in front of a folding table during a neighborhood outreach event. No press, no podium, just forms, hot coffee, and handshakes, because real redemption, she believed, wasn't broadcasted. It was witnessed. And then there was Jada. The young girl from the hostage incident had kept writing to Monroe. Short letters, sometimes drawings. One was a pencil sketch of Monroe holding a walkie-talkie in one hand and a child's hand in the other. The caption, "Heroes look like this, too." Monroe wrote back once, only once. "Be strong in silence. But don't be afraid to speak. The world is slow to hear people like us. Make them listen." Jada read it at her school's Black History Month assembly. As the months passed, Monroe's routine never changed much. She rose early, drank her tea without sugar, walked the 4 blocks to the Tempest program's office. She greeted everyone. She kept a mental list of who smiled back and who looked down. And every Friday, she led a drill called the Missed Voice. In it, trainees watched footage from real incidents where someone was ignored. They had 5 minutes to identify the error, name the bias, and reframe the outcome. Most failed the first time, but they improved, because that was her mission now. Not just to be remembered for what she did, but to train a generation that no longer needed her kind of miracle to see the truth. On the wall of her office hung 5 words, stitched in dark blue thread by a community elder who had followed her story. Respect is not a rank. It had become more than a motto. It was a standard, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not raise your voice, but simply refuse to let it be erased. The headlines no longer carried her name. The news cycle had moved on. The internet found new outrage, new icons, new noise. But every morning, just after the street lamps flicked off, and before the sun painted the sidewalk gold, Sergeant Althea Monroe unlocked the door to the Tempest program's Baltimore branch and flipped the lights on, alone, unhurried, unseen, and that was exactly how she preferred it. To the public, she was the woman who stopped a hostage crisis with a whisper, a symbol of quiet resilience, a meme, a quote in a training manual. But to those who worked beside her, who trained under her, and who healed because of her, she was something else entirely, a human blueprint for what justice looks like when it's stripped of ego and soaked in endurance. Althea never claimed to be a hero. She claimed space for herself, for others like her, for voices that cracked under the weight of being ignored too long. She never asked for applause. She asked simply to be heard before the emergency. That was her fight. Not the explosions, not the tactics, but the blindness that let systems ignore wisdom if it came wrapped in wrinkles, dark skin, or soft-spoken authority. She knew that reform couldn't be enforced by viral moments. It had to be lived daily, in corrections made in silence, in hands extended without cameras, in lessons delivered to people who once wouldn't look her in the eye. And in that silence, she created something lasting. The Tempest program, once dismissed as a goodwill experiment, was now a federally backed model studied in public policy classrooms. Cities were retrofitting emergency response protocols to reflect her method of layered consultation. Police academies began evaluating recruits, not only on tactical performance but on cognitive flexibility, how quickly they questioned their own assumptions. But Althea rarely spoke of any of that. Her apartment remained modest. Her shoes were always practical. On her living room wall hung a single photo, not of the hostage rescue, Not of her shaking hands with the mayor, but of a community BBQ where veterans and officers played dominoes under string lights, and a girl named Jada sat cross-legged at her feet, drawing a sketch of Commander Grandma. Because that was the legacy that mattered, not the medals, not the sound bites, but the proof that dignity, when protected fiercely and practiced consistently, could outlive policy. And late at night, when no one was watching, Althea would pull open the drawer of her desk, where she kept a worn piece of paper folded in fourths. On it, the original 5 words she had whispered that day on 14th Street. Strategic lead, Operation Iron Lantern. She never showed it to anyone, not out of secrecy, but because she no longer needed it to be believed. The world finally listened, not because she demanded it, but because she outlasted their doubt. And in doing so, she rewrote the rule book, not through volume, but through presence, through action, through grace, through silence that made the whole system stop and hear her.